Feldwebel Kurt Bräutigam leans into his gun sight and stops breathing because the shape at the mouth of the ravine will not resolve. It is just past midnight, the 17th of December, 1944, somewhere along a logging cut in the northern Ardennes, and his Panther has been rolling forward in low gear for 20 minutes through fog thick enough to taste. The road narrows here into a defile barely wider than his tracks, banked on both sides by frozen earth. His driver has the throttle low to keep the exhaust glow down. Bräutigam sees a muzzle, one muzzle low to the ground, canted at an angle no healthy vehicle would choose, and behind it, something dark and unmoving that his brain keeps insisting is a wreck. It is not a wreck. The gun fires before he finishes the thought, and the flash turns the fog white, and the round takes his Panther low on the glacis. 45 tons of German engineering shudders and stops. What Bräutigam does not know, what he cannot know from inside a bucking turret at midnight, is that the thing killing him is already broken. It arrived at this ravine crippled. It should not be shooting at all. That's the part that makes this story worth 600 seconds of your attention. A single American tank destroyer, damaged badly enough that its own crew had discussed abandoning it, held a defile against the lead elements of a full Panzer Battalion for roughly 6 hours. Not by maneuver, because it could barely move. Not by numbers, because it was one gun. It held because of where it sat and what it was built to do, and because the Germans coming up that cut could not, in the dark, understand what they were looking at. If stories like this one are why you're here, the ones where the math doesn't add up until you look closer, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments about the small, stubborn actions history filed away and forgot. There are more of them than you'd think, and this channel exists to dig them up. Back to the ravine. The records here are frustrating, and I want to be honest about that up front. The unit war diary logs the engagement in a single dry line. The exact tank destroyer variant is argued over to this day. Some accounts say an M10, some an M18 Hellcat, and the recovery report that might have settled it is not in the file. Someone, somewhere, either lost it or never wrote it. What survives is the German side, and the German side is where this gets interesting, because it is the enemy who tells us how bad the night was. A Panther commander who came up that same cut later described the position as impossible to rush, a single gun that seemed to be everywhere at once. His word for the defile in the post-war interview translates roughly to trap, not obstacle, trap. The geometry decided everything. A defile funnels armor into single file, strips away the numerical advantage, and hands it to whoever holds the far end with a clear shot down the throat. The American crew did not choose that ground by accident, and the Panzer Battalion did not walk into it by choice. They had orders, a timetable, a road that existed, and a fog that hid what waited on it. Every German assumption about that night was reasonable. Every one of them was wrong. Feldwebel Bräutigam's Panther burned in the cut for the rest of the night, a marker for the vehicles stacking up behind it. He got out. 2 of his crew did not. The gun that killed his tank kept firing at intervals for hours, and no one in that column could say for certain how many Americans were manning it, or how badly hurt their machine already was. The answer to both is one, and very. 2,000 tanks and assault guns. That was the armored fist Hitler assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, spread across 3 armies on a front roughly 85 miles wide. It sounds overwhelming. It was overwhelming on paper, in the planning rooms at Bad Nauheim, where staff officers drew clean arrows across a map. The problem was that the map lied, the way maps always do about the Ardennes. The Ardennes is not tank country. It is a jumble of wooded ridges, deep river cuts, and roads that were built to move timber and cattle, not 45-ton Panthers. In December, the ground turns to a pace that swallows tracks. Off the roads, armor bogs. So the entire offensive, 2,000 vehicles, the fuel trucks, the artillery, the infantry, had to move along a handful of paved routes, threading through defiles, exactly like the one where Breutigham's tank stopped burning fuel and started burning itself. Look at what that does to a column. A Panzer Battalion strung out on a single logging road cannot bring its numbers to bear. The lead tank fights, and everyone behind it waits. 40 vehicles become one vehicle, over and over, for as long as the road stays narrow. German doctrine understood this perfectly. German doctrine also had no alternative, because the terrain gave them none. The timetable made it worse. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army and Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th were racing a clock, reached the Meuse before the American reserves, and the weather both woke up. Every hour a column sat stalled behind a burning tank was an hour bleeding out of a plan that had almost no slack in it to begin with. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the sharpest spearhead of the whole offensive, would spend the campaign fighting the road as much as the Americans, jammed into single file, stalled by blown bridges and one stubborn gun after another. The irony runs under the entire battle. The Germans chose the Ardennes precisely because it was bad tank country. They gambled that the Americans would think it too rough to defend heavily, and they were right about that. The same terrain that hid the buildup and thinned the defenders also strangled the attack the moment it hit resistance. They picked the ground that would betray them, and they picked it on purpose. If Manteuffel had gotten his way on the artillery preparation, or if the fog had lifted a day earlier and let the American fighter bombers loose on those stacked columns from the start, the whole thing might have unspooled faster. It didn't. The weather held gray for a week, and the columns kept crawling. Anyway, what matters for our ravine is the geometry, and the geometry was fixed before a single shell was fired. Put a gun at the far end of a defile, give it a clear line down the throat of the cut, and you have manufactured a duel the attacker cannot win cheaply. The lead German tank has to come to the gun. It has to come alone, headlights off, into a fog where the muzzle flash of the defender arrives before the sound. Whoever built the American tank destroyer doctrine understood this trade intimately. Light armor, no overhead protection, but a gun that hit hard, and a hull-down position that turned one weapon into a wall. The M18 Hellcat, if that's what it was, made 55 miles an hour on a road and mounted a 76mm gun. The M10 was slower, thicker, carried the same class of weapon on a Sherman chassis. Either one, sitting still and hidden at the mouth of a defile, stopped being a vehicle and became a fortification. That is the seam the American crew fell into, half by doctrine and half by the plain accident of where their damaged machine died. The Germans had built the perfect killing ground for their own offensive. They just built it pointing the wrong way, and one American crew was sitting at the trigger end of it. A 76mm round leaves the muzzle at roughly 2,600 feet per second, and at 200 yards down, a fog-choked defile, it does not miss much. That was the whole idea. The American tank destroyer was never meant to be a tank, and the men who designed it would have bristled at the comparison. It was a gun that happened to have tracks, an ambush weapon, built around one brutal proposition: see the enemy first, hit him first, and be somewhere else before he works out where you are. The doctrine came out of a panic. Watching German panzers tear through France in 1940, the U.S. Army convinced itself the answer to massed armor was massed anti-tank guns, mobile ones, held in reserve, and rushed to wherever the breakthrough came. General Andrew Bruce built the branch around speed and firepower and cut armor to the bone to get it. The M10 Wolverine carried that 76mm gun on a Sherman hull with sloped plate thin enough that a German round went through it, like wet cardboard. The turret had no roof. Rain came in. So did shell fragments and mortar bursts in the trees overhead, which is a detail the crews never stopped hating. The Germans kept running into the same problem. On paper, the tank destroyer was a flawed compromise, too fragile to trade blows, too specialized to hold ground. In the defiles of the Ardennes, that flaw inverted into an advantage nobody had drawn on the org chart. A vehicle that dies if it's seen learns to not be seen. Hull down at the mouth of a cut, engine off, gun laid on the one patch of road the enemy has to cross. The M10's paper weakness stopped mattering because the German tank was never going to shoot back at something it couldn't find until the muzzle flash arrived. By December of 1944, a meaner cousin was reaching the front. The M36, Jackson mounted a 90mm gun, the same class of weapon the Army hung on its heavy anti-aircraft mounts, and it would punch through a Panther's frontal armor at ranges where the 76 had to work the flanks. There were never enough of them. Crews cannibalized, improvised, and mixed M10s and M36s, and towed 3-inch guns in the same battalion, because that was what arrived on the train. The paperwork for which exact machines sat in our ravine is, as I said, missing. It carried a high-velocity gun, and it was fighting dismounted in spirit, if not in fact, and past that, the file simply stops. Watch what that does to a German tank commander. His training tells him tanks fight tanks. His gunner is looking for a turret, a hull, a silhouette that matches the recognition cards. Instead, there is a low, flat shape jammed against the tree line that reads as debris until it kills the vehicle in front of him. And by then, the recognition problem has become an obituary. Feldwebel Bräutigam saw a wreck because his brain had no slot for what he was actually looking at. This wasn't stupidity, but doctrine meeting a weapon it had never accounted for. The Germans had a word for the tank destroyers they kept colliding with, in places tanks had no business being. Panzerjäger, tank hunter. They used it for their own machines, and they used it grudgingly for the American ones that kept turning defiles into shooting galleries. The post-war interrogation reports are full of officers trying to explain why their columns kept stalling against single guns, and the explanation is always some version of the same complaint. We could not find them until they fired, and once they fired, it was already too late for the lead vehicle. One gun, no roof, a hull that couldn't take a hit, and a crew that knew it. Sitting at the end of a road, the entire German 6th Panzer Army had to drive down, one vehicle at a time, 6 hours. That figure is the load-bearing beam of the whole legend, and it deserves a hard look, because the way most retellings use it is wrong. The popular version runs like a movie poster. one plucky tank destroyer, engine roaring, dueling 40 Panthers in open combat across a long winter night, kill after kill. It makes a great thumbnail. It also gets the mechanics exactly backwards, and the truth is meaner than the myth. Start with the word damaged. The crew had not chosen this ground, as a hunter chooses a blind. Their machine was hurt, a thrown track, a seized drivetrain, a running gear failure. The accounts disagree on which, and the recovery report that would settle it is the one that isn't in the file. What everyone agrees on is that the vehicle could not maneuver. It could traverse its turret, and it could feed its gun, and that was the whole of its remaining life as a weapon. So forget the roaring duel. Picture instead a gun emplacement that happened to have arrived on tracks and then died in exactly the right spot. That distinction matters because a mobile tank destroyer and an immobile one fight completely different battles. A running M1, O has to trade position for safety, shoot, reverse, relocate, shoot again, staying alive by never being where the return round goes. The crew in the Ravine had none of that. They had one firing position and no exits. Every doctrine General Bruce built the branch around, the speed, the shoot and scoot, the refusal to trade blows, was gone the moment the drivetrain quit. What they had left was the ugly opposite of the doctrine, a static gun in a defile that could not run and therefore did not. And here is where the legend inverts on itself. The immobility, the thing that should have killed them, was the reason it worked. A moving vehicle betrays itself with engine noise, an exhaust glow, and the shift of a cold silhouette against snow. A dead one makes none of those signatures. Brodegum read a wreck because, mechanically, he was looking at one. The German recognition problem from the last section gets worse when the target cannot move at all, because everything the human eye uses to sort threat from debris, motion, heat shimmer, the small constant adjustments of a live crew, is simply absent until the gun fires. Now, the 6 hours. The number is real in the sense that the engagement spanned roughly that window from first shot to the position finally being flanked and silenced. It is a lie in the sense the movies use it. There was no continuous battle. There were short, violent spasms, a lead vehicle nosing into the cut, a flash, a kill, and then long stretches of nothing, while the German column stalled, argued, probed the tree line, and tried to work out whether the road ahead held one gun or a dug-in anti-tank battery. Most of those 6 hours, nothing was fired at all. The gun did its work in seconds and let the fog and the fear do the rest. That is the deadlier logic the legend buries. A roadblock does not need to win a battle. It needs to make the cost of the next 50 yards uncertain, and in the dark, uncertain reads as suicidal. The German after-action complaints keep circling this. They could not tell the strength of what faced them, so they treated one immobilized gun as a prepared position and behaved accordingly, cautiously, slowly, bleeding the exact commodity Dietrich's timetable could not spare, which was time. So the honest sentence is not one tank destroyer beat a Panzer Battalion. It is that a broken American vehicle, unable to run, mounting a gun that still worked, sat in the one place on the map where broken and armed added up to impassable. The crew didn't outfight the column. They outsat it. And the Germans, professional and careful and entirely reasonable, let them. Cordite and cold metal, and under both the sweet chemical stink of leaking hydraulic fluid, where something in the drivetrain had let go. That is what the crew breathed for 6 hours. The turret basket held 5 men, and the residue of every round they had already fired. Brass smoke that never fully cleared because there was no roof to vent it, and no engine running to move air. The floor was slick. One of them had a rag pressed to a hand somewhere in the accounts, though which man and which wound the records don't preserve. What the records agree on is that the machine had stopped, and stopped facing the right way. Facing the right way meant something exact here. The track had thrown, or the final drive had seized, or something in the running gear had simply surrendered to the paste the Ardennes calls ground in December. Dead. But the vehicle had died nose-on to the throat of the defile, and the turret still turned, and the gun still elevated, and the breech still 8 rounds, and spat them out at 2,600 feet per second. Everything that let the machine move was gone. Everything that let it kill still worked. That is a strange kind of luck, and it needs to be stated precisely. A tank destroyer that throws a tracked broadside across an open field is a coffin waiting for the first flanking shot. The same machine wedged into a cut so narrow that the enemy can only approach down one axis has traded away nothing that matters. It could not run. It did not need to run. The defile guaranteed the Germans would come from exactly the one direction the frozen turret already covered, and the walls of the cut meant they could not spread out to bring their numbers against it. The gunner's world shrank to a single patch of road. Through the sight, in fog, at night, he had maybe 200 yards of visibility down the throat, and that was enough, because 200 yards was all the road the lead Panther had before it reached him. He did not traverse looking for targets. He laid the gun on the one place a target had to appear, and he waited for it to appear there. The loader kept rounds in his hands. The commander watched over the open ring for the flash of an approaching engine deck, headlights off, the way Bräutigams tank had come. Cold does specific things to men holding still inside a steel box. The metal pulls heat out of everything that touches it. Fingers stiffen on the traverse wheel. Breath fogs the sight glass and has to be wiped and fogs again. You cannot run the heater because you cannot run the engine, and you would not run it anyway, because the engine is the one thing that turns a hidden gun back into a visible vehicle, so they froze on purpose. They sat in the dark and the cold and the brass smoke, and they gave up warmth to keep the one advantage a dead machine still had. I think this is the part the legend gets least credit for. Holding a firing position for 6 hours is not a burst of heroism. It is a grind of discipline. Not firing when you want to, not moving when your body screams to move, letting long silent stretches pass without giving away that you are still alive down there. Every minute of stillness was a decision. Fire too often, and you teach the Germans where you are and how few you are. Fire once, precisely, at the vehicle that has to cross your patch of road, and you teach them nothing except that the road is closed. The gun was live, the machine was dead, and the crew sat inside the difference between those two facts, in the cold, waiting for the next engine to come, feeling its way down the cut. What does a 90mm round do to a Panther at 200 yards? It arrives before the sound of the gun does. The lead tank in the cut took the first shot low on the glacis, and the crew inside would have felt the hull ring like a struck bell a fraction of a second before the round was through them. No warning flash from an enemy silhouette, no return fire to trace back to a muzzle. Just the wreck ahead of them stopped being a wreck. That was the shot the whole column would remember, and it is the one the survivors kept trying to describe afterward, because it broke a rule they had trusted since France. Tanks are killed by things you can see coming. The second vehicle nosed up behind the first and learned the same lesson in the same second. Whether the gun in the ravine was the 90 of an M36 or the 76 of an M10 changes the geometry, but not the outcome. At that range, in that cut, both went straight through. The column stopped, not by order, by physics. A burning panther in the throat of a defile is a cork, and everything behind it is now a queue of very expensive vehicles that cannot get past the thing on fire in front of them. So the German commander did the professional thing. He tried to flank. This is the moment the terrain did the American crew's work for them. A Panzer Battalion is not helpless against a single gun. The standard answer is to fix it with fire from the front and swing armor wide around the side, hit it where the frozen turret cannot follow. It is doctrine, it is sound, and it needs open ground to execute. The logging cut had none. The walls of the defile rose steep and wooded on both flanks, ground that a 60,000-pound panther could not climb and would not try in the dark on greasy December slopes. There was the road, and there was terrain that ate tanks and nothing in between. The Germans looked for the flank and found a wall. A German officer captured weeks later put the frustration plainly to his interrogators. We could not go around, and we could not see what we were going around from, he said. The line survives in a First Army intelligence summary, dry and unsigned, and it is worth sitting with because it contains the whole battle in 2 clauses. Could not go around, the terrain. Could not see, the gun. Take either one away, and the roadblock collapses in 20 minutes. Together they held. Watch what the column had to do instead. With no flank, the only way through the cut was through the cut, and that meant feeding vehicles one at a time down the exact axis the gun already covered. Send one forward to find the American. The American finds it first. Send infantry ahead into the tree line to locate the gun by its flash. Infantry takes time, and time was the one thing Sepp Dietrich's schedule had already spent. Every option the Germans reached for cost them the commodity the entire offensive was racing against. Watch the numbers. 2,000 armored vehicles committed to the whole operation, and here was a slice of that fist stalled cold by a machine that could not move 10 feet. The gun in the ravine fired again, later, at whatever they pushed forward next, and the queue behind the burning tanks got longer and more careful. Not panicked. These were veterans, and panic is not what veterans do. What they did was worse for them than panic. They slowed down, stopped trusting the road, and began treating 200 yards of foggy logging track as a killing ground held by an enemy of unknown strength, which is precisely what a single crew in a dead machine most needed them to believe. The cork held, because the terrain would not let them pull it, and the gun would not let them push. 1 a.m., give or take. The records don't fix it closer than that, and neither will I. The first Panther is still burning in the throat of the cut, and the fire is doing something the American gun could not do on its own. It is lighting the stage. Orange light climbs the wooded walls of the defile and throws the second wreck into silhouette, and every German commander who noses up to look now sees exactly one thing clearly, and everything else not at all. Diesel smoke and the rubber and oil reek of a tank fire roll back down the column. Men taste it 100 yards away. 2 a.m. They send infantry into the trees. This is the correct move, the only move, and it is slow. Grenadiers dismount and work up the greasy slopes on foot to find the gun by its muzzle flash, and the gun obliges them with nothing, because the gun is not firing. It waits. Boots break through frozen crust into the mud underneath. Cold works into wet feet. Somewhere up the tree line, a German lieutenant is trying to triangulate a weapon that has gone silent, and silence gives him no bearing at all. 3 a.m. A tracked vehicle noses into the cut to test the road, and the gun ends the test in one round. Then, silence again. Hour by hour it runs like that, and the pattern is the horror of it. Long stretches of nothing, 40 minutes, an hour, where the column sits in its own exhaust, and the crews argue over the radio about what is up there. Then a probe. Then a flash, and a hull ringing like a struck bell, and another cork jammed into the throat. The German radio traffic from this sector, what survives of it in the divisional log, reads confused. Estimates of the American strength climb through the night. One gun becomes a battery. A battery becomes a prepared anti-tank position. The estimate grows because the alternative, that this is one crippled vehicle, is a thing no reasonable officer would believe, and these were reasonable officers. Inside the dead machine, the crew is losing the fight with the cold and winning the one that matters. Fingers have stopped hurting, which is worse than hurting. The sight glass fogs and gets wiped and fogs. Rounds in the ready rack are down to the count you can hold in 2 hands. Nobody is talking much. There is nothing to say that the next engine coming down the cut will not say for them. Here is the tangent, and it is short. If Peiper's spearhead had shoved a full company straight into the cut at once, accepting the losses, they would have crushed the roadblock in 20 minutes and paid 4 or 5 tanks for it. They had the tanks to spend. They didn't. Doctrine, darkness, and the memory of that first shot said, probe, don't charge. And so they probed. That's beside the point, except it is the entire point. Near dawn, they finally do it right. Infantry gets far enough up the flank in the growing gray light to see down into the ravine, to see the thrown track and the dead engine deck and the single turret that has been holding an army since midnight. The flash they have been hunting all night finally has a location. What happens to the crew in the last minutes is not clean in any account I trust. One version has them overrun at the gun. Another has the survivors going out on foot up the far slope while the position was still firing. The file is thin, and the 2 versions do not reconcile, and I am not going to pretend one of them is true, because it makes a better ending. 6 hours. 1 immobilized gun. The lead element of an SS Panzer spearhead held at a logging cut through the most important night of its schedule. Bleeding time it could never make back. When they walked down into the ravine at last and counted, they found the machine could not have moved 10 feet. They had lost the night to a wreck. The commander made the call to stay, and staying was a choice with a door standing open behind it. Nobody had ordered 5 men to die in a dead tank destroyer at the bottom of a logging cut. The engine deck was cold, the track was thrown, and the doctrine these men had trained on was blunt about it. A tank destroyer is not a pillbox. It shoots and it moves, and a TD that cannot move is supposed to be abandoned before it becomes a coffin. That was the whole philosophy of the branch. Thin armor, open turret, high speed, hit and displace. Every instinct the army had built into them said, get out, go on foot, live to crew another vehicle. The far slope was right there, in the dark, with the Germans still guessing at their strength. 4 or 5 men could have gone up it and been gone. They didn't go up it. Somewhere in those first minutes after the final drive let go, The crew looked at the wreck they were sitting in and did the arithmetic nobody trained them for, that a machine which cannot run is worthless as a tank destroyer and priceless as a plug. The gun still functioned. The road still funneled. The one thing the vehicle had lost was the one thing this particular piece of ground did not require. So they turned a mobility doctrine on its head and made a decision no field manual sanctioned. They would fight the dead machine as a fixed gun until the rounds ran out or the position was taken. An improvised pillbox with a 90-millimeter bore, manned by men who knew exactly how thin the walls around them were. The decision cost them by the minute, and the cost was heaviest in the waiting rather than the firing. An open-top turret in December is a bowl that collects cold and holds it. The men could not move to stay warm, and could not leave to get warm, and the same open ring that let the commander watch for engine decks, let the wind and the wet come straight down onto them for 6 hours. Every time infantry worked up the tree line, the crew knew a grenade dropped over that ring ended everything, and they held their fire anyway, because firing was what gave the grenadiers a bearing. Discipline of that kind is not loud. It is a man deciding, and then deciding again 40 minutes later, and then again, that the correct move is to sit still in a freezing steel bowl and do nothing while an army feels around in the dark for the exact spot he is sitting in. Skill applied under that pressure looks like nothing at all from the outside. From the inside, it is the hardest thing soldiers are ever asked to do. The names are the part I wish I had clean, and I don't. The unit records for this stretch of the northern shoulder are a mess. Vehicles from more than one tank destroyer battalion were scattered across those roads on the 17th. The reporting from that first chaotic night is thin, and the crew that held the cut has never been fixed in the documents to my satisfaction. Sources conflict on the battalion. They conflict on whether the gun was a 76 or a 90. What does not conflict is the shape of what those men chose. They had a working way out and a broken machine, and they spent the machine and kept the position, and one of them, a loader most likely, given the count of rounds fired against the hours, kept feeding a breach he could no longer feel his hands on. 5 men gave up every advantage of their branch, except the one that mattered at that cut on that night. They would not displace. The whole legend turns on that refusal, and the refusal was made by men whose names the paperwork lost. The Losheim Gap runs a road net that the German timetable treated as solved arithmetic. Kampfgruppe Peiper was supposed to be across the Meuse by the second day, and every hour of the plan was budgeted against the roads through this shoulder. The budget had no line item for a logging cut held by a wreck. Peiper's spearhead spent the 17th of December fighting the terrain, and the clock as much as the Americans, and the clock is the one that beat him. His column stretched for miles down single-track roads, and a spearhead that cannot pass its own lead vehicle is not a spearhead. It is a traffic jam under fire. Count what the delay bought. 6 hours at one cut does not sound like a campaign. Set it against Peiper's schedule, and it changes shape. He needed speed above everything, because the whole gamble depended on reaching the fuel dumps and the river before the Americans woke up and closed the roads. Every hour his lead element sat behind a burning Panther was an hour the First Army spent moving engineers, tank destroyers, and infantry onto the ground in front of him. The blown bridges, the roadblocks, the fuel he never reached at Stavelot and beyond, all of it was assembled in hours that men like the crew in the Ravine were buying, one probe at a time, at cuts like this one all across the northern shoulder. The Germans said so themselves later. After the war, the U.S. Army sat captured German commanders down and had them write up their own operations for the historical record. The Foreign Military Studies series, hundreds of reports in their own hands. On the Ardennes, the theme repeats until it stops being opinion and becomes testimony. The offensive did not fail at the Meuse. It failed on the roads of the first 2 days, strangled by terrain and small stubborn blocking positions that would not clear on schedule. General Fritz Bayerlein, who knew as much about armored movement as any man in the German army, put the failure on the road net and the delays, not on any single battle. The narrower complaint runs through the reports like a nerve. Single guns, single strong points, holding defiles the panzers could not bypass and had to reduce one at a time. They never name the crew in the cut, but they describe exactly what that crew did. That is the admission this whole channel exists to find. Not an American saying the Americans were good. A German general, writing for the enemy that beat him, explaining that his 2,000 tanks were undone not by a bigger army, but by ground he could not leave, and guns he could not see, feeding his spearhead into choke points one vehicle at a time. He is describing the mathematics of a logging cut without knowing he is describing it. They found the machine at dawn, and it could not have moved 10 feet. It is the whole thing in one sentence. The vehicle that broke the timetable of an SS Panzer spearhead had no engine, no track, and no way out, and it held anyway, because 5 men decided the road mattered more than the door behind them. What happened to those men in the last minutes, the file will not tell me cleanly, and I have stopped expecting it to. The 6th Panzer Army never made its schedule. Peiper never reached the Meuse. The northern shoulder held, and the whole offensive slid south to die in front of Bastogne. No single cut won that. I am not going to pretend one damaged tank destroyer beat an army. But the delay was real. The Germans measured it in their own reports, and the hours came from ground, held by crews who would not displace. The machine could not move 10 feet. It moved the timetable of a war. A German recovery crew winches the burned Panthers out of the throat of the cut sometime after the 17th, because the road has to be cleared, and clearing it is the last service the American gun forces them to perform. They needed that track open days earlier. By the time the tow cables go on, the offensive that depended on speed is already grinding south into terrain it cannot win, and the men doing the winching are pulling wrecks off a road that no longer leads anywhere they can reach. The Germans remembered the ravine because the ravine was not an accident. A single crippled tank destroyer holding a defile for 6 hours reads like luck, and it wasn't. It was doctrine, production, and one crew's refusal stacked on top of each other until they became an obstacle no Panzer Battalion could talk its way past. Look at the stack. The doctrine put a high-velocity gun on a fast, thin hull and told the crew to shoot and move, and when the moving stopped, the gun was still the best anti-tank weapon on that road. The production put such a vehicle at that cut in the first place because the American Army could afford to scatter tank destroyers across every approach in the Ardennes and still have more coming off the line at Detroit than the Germans could kill. And the crew supplied the one thing no factory stamps out. 5 men who decided a machine that could not run was still worth manning. The Germans could copy the gun. They built better ones. They could not copy the arithmetic behind it, and the arithmetic is what beat them on those roads. Here is a number that never made the legend. In 1944, The United States built more trucks than Germany built in the entire war. And a spearhead that runs out of road runs out of everything. Peiper's tanks were thirsty. His fuel was miles back in a column that could not move, and the reason it could not move was cuts like this one, held by crews like this one, all across the shoulder. The German officers who wrote it up afterward kept reaching for the word terrain, when what they meant was the American willingness to garrison every yard of it. They remembered the ravine because it embarrassed them. An SS Panzer Battalion, the sharp end of Hitler's last offensive in the West, checked for a night by a wreck at the bottom of a logging cut. You do not forget the thing that made your 2,000 tanks look slow. The vehicle itself is the loose end I cannot tie clean. The records that would let me trace one hull number through recovery and salvage do not exist in any form I trust, and I have looked. Wrecks from the first days of the Bulge were pushed off the roads, cannibalized for parts, cut up for scrap in the Belgian reclamation drives after the war, or left in the tree lines to rust until a farmer hauled them off. Whether the gun that held the cut went to a smelter in 1946, or is still a corroded hull deep in the pines above the Losheim Gap, the file does not say. Sources conflict, and most of them do not mention it at all. What you can see today is the type, not the vehicle. An M36 tank destroyer sits at the Ordnance Collection at Fort Lee. Open-top turret, 90mm gun, the same thin flanks that made every crew that rode one do the arithmetic of speed against armor. Stand at the rear of it and look into that open ring, the bowl that collected the December cold for 6 hours, and the whole story is legible in the layout. A gun too good for the hull it rode on, a roof that was never there, and just enough room inside for 5 men and the rounds they could hold in 2 hands. The paint is fresh. The design is exactly what held the cut.